am the Maven of the Eventide, and I am a vampire fan. Surprise! Now, I don't tell everyone in the world that I am a vampire fan. I don't go around telling little old church ladies because they'll probably think I'm evil and be mean to me. How can you like that awful satanic stuff? Don't you know vampires are evil? Yes, Maud, I do. That's why I love them. I love monsters. And as you know, I've never been much of a fan of vegetarian vampires. Vampires who are basically superheroes, all of the powers with none of the moral ambiguity of having to hurt people in order to live. I like my vampires to be monsters, horrors, killers, scourges on humanity. They can feel sad about it, sure. They can look gorgeous while doing it, sure, but they can't stop it. It is the very nature of being a vampire. So, needless to say, Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles is my absolute favorite brand of vampires. All of the monstrousness, all of the horror, but mixed with moral, philosophical discussions of how a vampire can cope with the consequences while being unable to avoid being a killer. And the fashion is gorgeous. This is my Louis doll. Louis from Interview with the Vampire, as portrayed by Brad Pitt in the 1994 hit movie. Louis is bae. I love Louis. Who's my pretty little vampire, so sad and angsty, yet still a monstrous killer who eats people every night. The perfect blend. No, they didn't make a Lestat doll. They only made this one, and then the company went out of business. So, there has been a lot of news lately about the new upcoming Anne Rice Vampire TV show. Just a couple of days ago, the lead actor was announced. There's our new Louis. A lot of people are hearing things about this show now for the first time, but if you are in the Vampire Chronicles fandom, you'll know that we've been hearing about it for years, and I've talked about it multiple times on my channel. But I am here tonight to catch up all the rest of you with some important context for the development of how this TV show came to be, as well as talk about some of the big changes it's making to the source material. Okay, so for many years, Anne Rice has been dreaming about and talking extensively on social media about creating a prestige TV show that would go through her entire 18-book series of the Vampire Chronicles and the Witch Trilogy. These books are all part of a shared universe in the Vampire Chronicles, and the characters cross over between the witches and the vampires, so you really can't do the vampires without the witches. I talked about all this already a lot more recently in the video I made of how I personally rank all the books and the correct reading order. You should go watch that video. We have fun. Anne Rice used to be very active on Facebook and social media. She hasn't been recently. Her Facebook posts are now all managed by Anne's team, and we never really hear from her much directly anymore. I'm a little worried. She's getting older. She'll be 80 this year. I hope she's all right. But up until a couple years ago, she was very active, interacting with fans directly and regularly, talking about her books, asking fans their opinions on things, and she talked a lot about this TV show she was dreaming of making. She referenced Game of Thrones often as a template for the kind of show that she dreamed about for Vampire Chronicles, saying that she thought television was in a golden age and how this kind of TV series format was much more ideal for telling a story like Vampire Chronicles than movies would be. And in 2016, she finally would be able to have the chance to make that show because she reacquired the screen rights for her series. Before that, the rights were held by Universal Pictures, who bought them in 2014 and have been trying and failing to make a new movie version of Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Lestat. In May of 2016, it was announced that the film was in development with Josh Boone of the New Mutants fame to direct it, but by November of 2016, Anne Rice had the rights back. And she announced that she was done trying to make movies and an epic open-ended TV series was her new dream. I don't know why she got the rights back in November 2016 after this movie was announced in May. My guess would be that as they were developing this movie that was announced in May, things didn't go the way she wanted. So she took her rights back, bought them back, or however she did it, and decided she wanted to go the TV direction instead. She told us that she was developing this dream show hand in hand with her son Christopher Rice, who is also a novelist and screenwriter, and that Christopher was writing the script for the pilot episode himself. They told us that they wanted the TV series to start off with the beginning of The Vampire Lestat, the second book in the series. That's Lestat's life story before he meets Louis, and it serves as a prequel to Interview with the Vampire. Lestat would be the main character of the TV series, and she often asked people on her Facebook page what actors they would like to see in the role. She mentioned that even though Lestat is immortally 20 years old, well, almost 21, he was made into a vampire like the week before his birthday. She asked if we wouldn't mind if they cast an older, more seasoned actor who could better portray an immortal character than someone who looks 20. And, well, Anne, since you asked me, I am fine with that. I, too, would rather see a better actor in the role than a 20-year-old drama student. Tom Cruise was 31 when he played Lestat. There was often much talk among fans of how would they cast Armand. Armand is an immortally 17-year-old character, but he's a very sexual character and has sex scenes as young as the age of 15. But, 22-year-olds get cast as high school students in TV shows all the time. I figured they'd go that route. Much speculation and fan casting on the Anne Rice Facebook page. For instance, tons of fans like the idea of the two main actors from that TV show Versailles playing Lestat and Louis because they had a similar dynamic in their show. Actor Cody Fern from American Horror Story was also a huge fan favorite. I personally didn't like any of these suggestions, and since Anne asked, I always said I would love to see someone who was cast for their talent, not their name. Some no-name actor who came out of nowhere and just wowed us. Someone who just truly embodied the spirit of Lestat and Louis. I don't even care what they look like, as long as they were like Hollywood pretty, like believably beautiful and glamorous for the sake of being seductive vampires. People in this fandom get so hung up on hair color, and I'm just like, who cares? That is such a white person thing to care about. It's their personalities that matter to me. It's all about the attitude. So, Anne and Christopher shopped their project around, and in 2017, the series was optioned by Paramount TV and Anonymous Content. Whoa! Great news! Now we just need a showrunner and a network. The next big news we got was in January of 2018, when it was announced that Bryan Fuller had joined the team as showrunner. Bryan Fuller! He's the guy who did Hannibal, Pushing Daisies, American Gods. We were so excited. He would make this epic multi-season series amazing. Then, at the beginning of May 2018, Christopher Rice shows us the title page of his pilot script for the TV show. The TV show is called The Vampire Lestat, and the pilot episode is titled Wolf Killer, which is how the Vampire Lestat book starts. So now we know they're really going forward with this idea of a TV series starting with Lestat's life story that would probably then flow into the Interview with the Vampire story with Louis and Claudia for season 2 maybe, and then keep going from there with one book a season. And I'm guessing weaving in the more ancient vampires' life stories as flashbacks for B plots, and meanwhile bringing in the Mayfair witch stories as C and D plots to build up towards where the two series eventually cross over. I can picture it all, and with Bryan Fuller at the helm, Paramount TV, and Anonymous Content, it would be great. Everything's coming up Millhouse. Then, 2 weeks later, Bryan Fuller left the project. Why? Did he not like the script? No one knows. So sad. But they would find another showrunner. They just needed to know what network or platform the series was going to be on. So there's a bidding war for the series, and in July of 2018, Hulu wins this bidding war. And now the TV series is all set to become a Hulu original. Okay, I guess I can subscribe to Hulu. Not that big of a deal. I've done worse things. I don't know that much about the quality of Hulu's original series, but hey, it's happening. The show is happening. It's happening. And the pilot is Wolf Killer, and all our dreams are going to come true. We don't hear much about the show for a few months. Anne and Christopher tell us off and on Facebook that things are in the works and exciting stuff is happening behind the scenes. But then a year goes by and still nothing. But we can be patient. We've waited centuries. Decades. But we can keep waiting. And Blood Communion was published in 2018, so it wasn't like we got nothing. And Anne Rice hasn't outright said that Blood Communion is the last book in the Vampire Chronicles, but it certainly feels like the last book. It ties up all the stories with a happily ever after ending for Lestat and Louis and friends. So 2018 ends. 2019 goes by, still nothing. We're all wondering what's going on with the show. And then, in December of 2019, we get the news. Hulu has dropped the show, and Anne Rice gets the rights back again. Instead, back to the starting board. Now, no one told us why Hulu dropped the show, why there was so much silence for a year and a half, why Brian Fuller stepped away. Popular fandom speculation is that it's because Anne Rice is too controlling, and they could not come to agreements. There are plenty of stories of how controlling and demanding Anne Rice was during the production of the Tom Cruise movie, how upset she was by the choices that they made, and then she retracted those feelings later when she saw how good the movie actually came out, how epically disappointed she was in the Queen of the Damned movie for changing so much of the story. She hates that movie. How she's refused to let her books be edited because editing would compromise her vision. Her words, her way, and nothing else is to be tolerated. But Hollywood has a way of liking to make money. And if they thought Anne Rice's dream show of telling the whole series, starting with the vampire Lestat, according to her tightly controlled vision, wasn't going to be financially lucrative, and she refused to let them change things, they'd step away. And so the fans speculate that no other networks were willing to pick up the show with Anne and Christopher having such tight control over it and making such strict demands. And knowing how serious Anne is about her visions, would she never let go of that control and compromise to give a studio a chance to ruin her work? Would this be the end of our dream? Would the perfect, canon-accurate show we've all longed for never come to pass? Well, a few months go by. COVID hits, so of course nothing's getting done. And also, somewhere along the lines, Anne Rice has gradually stopped interacting so much on Facebook and seems to fade away from the public eye. We're all about ready to accept that now the show is never going to happen. But then, in May 2020, it's announced that AMC has bought the rights to the entire Vampire Chronicles series and the Mayfair Witch trilogy. We have a new network. It's back on, baby! And this is serious enough that Anne makes a whole new Facebook fan page just for this production. We get the news that Roland Jones will be the showrunner and directing the first couple episodes. You'd know him as the producer of Weeds, Boardwalk Empire, The Exorcist TV show. And Anne is quoted as saying, "It's always been my dream to see the worlds of my two biggest series united under a single roof so that filmmakers could explore the expansive and interconnected universe of my vampires and witches. That dream is now a reality, and the result is one of the most significant and thrilling deals of my long career." That's interesting. Filmmakers exploring the expansive universe doesn't sound quite as much like she's in control here. But hey, she's happy, and that gives us hope. She won't let anything weird happen, right? This is Anne Rice we're talking about. Of course, for the rest of the year, nothing else happens. It's COVID, we can understand, and Anne's team posts on Facebook now and then that exciting things are going on behind the scenes that they can't talk about yet, but the show is in the works. Well, more than a year passes, and the fandom's starting to have our doubts again. But then, this is where it starts getting interesting. A casting call for actors for a TV show called Interview with the Vampire is leaked and published by a somewhat disreputable website called the Illuminati. And based on the info of what this casting call is looking for in actors, the fans are shook. Nobody can believe it's real. It has to be a hoax, right? A fake leak that was put out there to throw people off. This info was not published anywhere else on the internet or anywhere. Anne and Christopher Rice remain absolutely silent, do not acknowledge its existence despite repeated questions on their Facebooks and social media. Nothing is corroborated. It can't be real. So, real or not, why were the fans so thrown by this casting call, by these character descriptions? Well, let me just read it to you. Our sources say that Interview with the Vampire will consist of 8 one-hour episodes and will be executive produced by Jessica Held and Mark Johnson. Roland Jones is not only a part of the development of Interview with the Vampire, he is attached to write the upcoming series as well. All right, first of all, the fact that it's called Interview with the Vampire and is an 8-episode series is already not the Vampire Lestat Wolf Killer sweeping open-ended multi-season series that Anne and Christopher were talking about. So that already right there, that's a big change. Why would they retell the Interview with the Vampire story for a TV show? We already have that movie. That's a weird place to start when you could start in a different place and work up to it. The new Interview with the Vampire series will follow Daniel Malloy, an award-winning investigative journalist. Daniel is the name of the character who interviews the vampire in the original book and the original movie. But he's definitely not an award-winning journalist in the book. He is a 20-year-old kid who's just getting his feet wet interviewing a vampire. And then in later books, he becomes a vampire himself after being horribly traumatized by getting mixed up with vampires for many years before it finally happens. Now he's an award-winning investigative journalist. Daniel takes his second chance to report one of the most significant stories of his career as a journalist. Daniel travels to the other side of the world to interview the 146-year-old vampire Louis de Pointe-de-Lac. Louis shares the tale of his astounding and sinful journey to immortality once and for all. Second chance. Okay, so what I'm getting from this is that Daniel interviewed Louis in 1973 like he does in the books, and now he's going to get a second chance to talk to Louis again in modern times. Daniel is not a vampire, he stayed mortal, and he grew up, and now he's an award-winning journalist, and you'll see why I think that later. The other big thing I'm noticing here is that Louis now, in 2021 or 2022, whenever this is going to happen, is 146 years old, instead of 255 years old, which means that, based on what I calculate later, that sets the events of Interview with the Vampire in the year 1910 or so, instead of in the year 1791. So we've got a time period change and a second interview happening. Daniel Malloy will be one of the lead characters in Interview with the Vampire, and casting is looking for a 60 to 70-year-old man and his open ethnicity. Daniel Malloy is described as slight, but with a huge chip on his shoulder. Malloy is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigator journalist who works for the San Francisco Chronicle, Los Angeles Times, and The Guardian. With a career full of ups and downs, he considers himself a wealth of knowledge and experience, and now, during the COVID pandemic, Daniel Malloy is also a professor teaching an online class. Daniel has a chance to conduct an interview with a vampire for the second time. Louis de Pointe-de-Lac. In the past, Daniel's drug use inhibited his professionalism during the first interview, so he knows he needs to conduct it the right way this time. Okay, so from what I'm getting from that is that in 1973, when Daniel first interviewed Louis, like the movie you saw, like the book you read, he was strung out on drugs because, he was 20. He was living in San Francisco. It was the 70s. It was what you did. So he got the interview wrong. So now that he's grown up and he's 60 to 70 years old, he's going to go find Louis again, re-interview him, and get the story right this time. So we're going to get a different story. Louis de Pointe-de-Lac is another lead character in Interview with the Vampire, and casting is looking for a 33-year-old black man for the role. Louis de Pointe-de-Lac is described as Creole, beautiful, eyes are brilliant green. His skin is smooth as if sculpted from Sicilian ebony. Although Louis appears to be 33 years old, he is in truth 146. Before Louis was turned into a vampire, he owned 8 brothels of the 12 on his street in New Orleans. All right. So, Louis is now no longer a white man who was born in France, came over to New Orleans as a child with his parents who owned 2 indigo plantations and inherited those indigo plantations when his father died. He is now a born in New Orleans Creole of mixed descent. They want to cast a black man. with green eyes. Good luck finding that. He could wear contacts. Brad Pitt wore contacts. He's only 146, so the story is in the 1910s, and instead of owning plantations, he owns 8 brothels. So instead of Louis being a slave owner, he's a pimp, a black pimp. How many drugs were you on in 1973, Daniel, to get the story that wrong in your first interview that now you have to go and correct it and tell the story right this time to tell us that Louis is actually not a white man and he is not a slave owner in the 1790s. He is a brothel owner with 8 brothels in the 1910s. What were you on, Daniel? Louis maintained a veneer of self-assuredness and pride through hubris and belligerence. And while respected by many, he was disregarded by his wealthy counterparts for his skin color. So that's another big change. Louis's personality in Interview with the Vampire, he's got a fiery side, he's got an aggressive side, but overall, he is a very quiet, pensive, broody man. He is not belligerent. He does not have hubris. I mean, everyone has hubris, but that self-assuredness, no. Louis' defining character trait is guilt, shame, and misery. Even before he becomes a vampire, like he starts off the book grieving because he blames himself for his brother's death. He is just one giant ball of mopey emo guilt. And this sounds like a very different person. So Daniel not only got his story wrong, he got his entire character personality wrong. For truth and reconciliation, Louis de Pointe-de-Lac calls upon Daniel Malloy, an investigative journalist, to finally tell his true tale. It's worth noting that the role of Louis de Pointe-de-Lac is for a 2-year deal. So that means if this 8-episode Interview with the Vampire series does well, there might be a second series. I did see in a different news article that the 2-year deal, the first year is for all 8 episodes, but the second year is only for 2 episodes. So if they're going to go into the second year and do Vampire Lestat or Queen of the Damned, we're only going to get Louis contractually for 2 episodes in those, unless the actor is willing to take on more. But whatever they have planned for it, Louis is only in the script for 2 episodes, which, it's Louis. You can't just write him out of the script. The article goes on to talk about the article writer's feelings about these changes, but those changes that were listed were from a casting call of character descriptions that were leaked to this disreputable Illuminati website. So all the fans don't want to believe them, right? So Louis retelling his life story to get it right this time. This isn't the epic, sweeping Game of Thrones style, canon-accurate, multi-season TV show starting with the Vampire Lestat and Wolf Killer. This is an Interview with the Vampire AU fanfic miniseries. This isn't the dream. This can't be real, right? How would Anne stand for this? The first stage of grief is denial. So, it's May. And I have a strong hunch that this leak is real, even though it's not corroborated anywhere else. It's too specific to be fake, despite what all of my friends and other fans really want to believe. But having worked as an actor and been connected to the industry, it seems too legit to me. The most I can hope for is that this ends up getting scrapped and changed in development and they go back to canon, because, that happens sometimes. But highly doubtful. My speculation at this point in May is that in order to get the show made at all, Anne Rice had to let go of that control she was seizing that we all speculated was keeping anyone else from wanting to work with her. She had to give up her dream show, the canon-accurate sweeping series, and let AMC just buy the rights and do whatever they wanted with the rights, play in her sandbox of this universe she created, because that's how Hollywood works. Now, going on the assumption that this casting call is legit, the leak is real, the biggest conversation here with this info is changing Louis to be a black person. This is not like a Johnny Storm situation where they just want to cast a black actor because black actors are awesome. They are changing the entire story to be a black person's story about his struggles being a black brothel owner in New Orleans in the 1910s. Even though this change introduces some uncomfortable dynamics to Louis being embroiled with white Lestat, I can see why they would want to do this. Louis is a Creole from New Orleans, and it's rather a shame that everyone in the original story is white anyway, when the black and mixed race population in New Orleans is such a huge part of its culture. Did you know that Anne Rice wrote a book about the free people of color in New Orleans that was made into a movie with James Earl Jones? Being from New Orleans herself, it's always been a culture that's interested her. And of all the characters that are in this series, Louis is the one that you most often see race-bent in the fandom. There is plenty of fan art out there of brown-skinned Louis. Fans have been connecting his personality and emotional journey to that of people of color for ages. Why not let Louis be a person of color? We have enough white dudes on TV already as it is. If you're not going to do this 100% canon-accurate adaptation, then sure, I'm all for this. We rarely ever get black vampires, especially in mainstream big-budget TV shows, and even more rarely get stories where their ethnicity is relevant to the plot and the character development, and for it to be the show's main character? To all you racist people out there saying, "We can't be black, he's supposed to be white," I hereby revoke your fandom cards. The entire point of Interview with the Vampire is identifying with the emotional plight of the outsider. Go be racist elsewhere, please. Yes, it is going to make it more gross when Lestat dominates over Louis's life and Louis fills this subservient role to him. The bitch role, as Brad Pitt so eloquently called it when he played the part in the movie. But even though Lestat's the hero in the later books of the series, take your Lestat shipping goggles off for a moment. In Interview, he's the villain. They do not have a good relationship. Lestat is abusive in so many ways. So if Black Louis is victimized by White Lestat, then there you go. All the more villainy for Lestat. They can grow and change and become better people about it later in the series, along with how they do for all the other abuse Lestat ever heaped on Louis. Calm thy tits. Your ship can still sail. But bigger than the Lestat-Louis relationship stickiness, if you're going to change a character in the book whose personality and backstory hinge on his white privilege, which is an essential part of shaping his vampire journey, you can't just cast a black actor in the role. You have to completely change the character. New backstory, new personality, new way of relating to being a vampire. This is going to make for a very different story, time period, location, affiliations. Louis is now a different character, and I'll talk more about that soon. But first, let me finish catching you up on the news. So this article came out in May, and it only talks about Louis and Daniel. What about Lestat? Does the fact that there's no casting call for Lestat mean he's already cast? Did they go with some big-name star? Does that mean he won't be good at embodying the character? Are they going to straight-wash him? Or maybe they're going to cast a woman? Did you know that back when the 1994 Tom Cruise Brad Pitt movie was in development, they considered casting a woman for Louis? Yes, changing Louis away from his canon character is not a new idea. They were actually going to cast Cher. She even wrote a whole song about it because she was that much on board with the project before they scrapped that plan and decided to go back to canon and choose Brad Pitt instead. So the fact that the whole Cher plan got scrapped and they did go back to canon, that's the hope that I was holding on to, that even if this casting call article is real, maybe they'll scrap that idea and go back to canon. Maybe. Not that I wouldn't totally be excited about Louis being played by a black actor, but the whole 1910 brothel thing, where's my 1790s fashion? Louis the pimp. So the only news we get publicly after this leak in May is several outlets reporting that AMC is developing an 8-episode TV series called Interview with the Vampire. To me, this confirms the Illuminati leak, because they had that info in there, the fact that it's an 8-episode series called Interview with the Vampire instead of the sweeping epic, etc., etc., etc. So since that bit was true, can all the rest of the casting info be true too? And then, in July, so last month, July 15th, the Illuminati published another casting link, which confirms its previous one from May, which again, no one else anywhere has corroborated or confirmed. But this leak makes it sound like nothing has changed from the previous one. So let me read you this one as well. As part of Roland Jones's overall deal with AMC Studios, he will serve as writer, executive producer, and showrunner on Interview with the Vampire. Mark Johnson will serve as executive producer on Interview with the Vampire as part of his own overall deal with AMC Studios. Wow, whoever wrote this article is really wordy. Anne Rice and her son Christopher Rice are also part of the upcoming series, serving as non-writing executive producers. So that script that Christopher Rice was writing, the fact that Anne Rice wanted Christopher to write the entire series, they're not doing any writing for this series. They are executive producers. That could be in name only. They could be consulting. They could be heavily involved. But considering how different things are so far, I had the feeling that it's in name only and they are cut out of the creative process entirely. That's what I'm worried about. So here, more character descriptions for casting call, and it starts off with Lestat. So Lestat hasn't been cast yet. Whew, gives me hope. Lestat de Lincourt, they misspell his name, is one of the leads of Interview with the Vampire, Caucasian, in his 20s or 30s. Lestat is a vampire and captivating presence who attracts appreciation and attention of men and women alike. So far, so accurate. Completely at ease with himself, Lestat draws people to him and obtains respect through his charm, intelligence, and sexual magnetism. Okay. Yes, that is all very true. However, a big thing about Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles is that the vampires have zero interest in sex whatsoever. Blood replaces sex for them. They do not have sex. Considering this is being set in a brothel, I'm wondering if they're going to change that and have the vampires start having a bunch of sex, which... Lestat is insistent that he gets what he wants, and when facing rejection, petulance can quickly turn to ruthless rage, which causes frenzied acts of horrifically brutal violence. That's a bit more extreme than Lestat ever is in the book. I guess the show wants to up the gore factor. They want a lot more sex and violence in their TV show. Hollywood! Lestat also has mind control abilities. I mean, they're all psychic. Louis not psychic because he's not strong enough. Every single other vampire in the series is psychic and can kind of mind control a little bit. But I wonder why they're emphasizing that. How much are they going to lean into that? Lestat initially infuriates Louis, but this soon turns to fascination, which leads Louis to question his religion and sexuality. So that's the opposite of the books. In the books, Louis is fascinated by Lestat until he becomes a vampire and becomes disillusioned, and then he's frustrated with Lestat and kind of hates him for a while. So they're doing it the opposite way. And the fact that Louis is going to question his religion and sexuality makes me think that Lestat's going to be his gay awakening, which, that's good. That's good. It's not, they're not straight washing it. I just hope it's not like weakly done. I hope they really do it well. Lestat entering Louis' life leads to the ruin of his close relationship with his family. That happens in the book. Not only is Lestat a lead role in Interview with the Vampire, it looks like the role will also require options for 5 other potential series. This isn't entirely shocking given the fact that AMC is looking to build a universe around Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. So 5 potential series. Okay. 5 other. So that's 6 total. So Interview 1, Vampire Lestat 2, Queen the Damned 3, Body Thief 4, Memnock 5, come down here to Blackwood Farm and Blood Canonical for 6? Or are we going to skip those? But why would we skip those if we're adding the Mayfair Witches in for the whole sake of making the crossovers make sense? I think we would need those, like Mayfair buildup, right? Are we not going to do the 3 new books? Are we skipping the new trilogy? Or are they just going to see how things go? Why 5? But, it's good. They're thinking ahead. They're planning. And these aren't additional seasons on the main series. These are 5 separate series. Oh, here's that other note I mentioned to you. Louis will also require options for another potential series and will be expected to appear in 2 episodes in further series, subject to the actor's availability. So Louis is not guaranteed to be in future seasons in any of these books, even though he is in this book, he's in the end part of this book, so it depends if they do this with the framing device or if they just do it in the flashback. He's definitely in these books, so they're going to write him out. They're going to give Lestat a new love interest. Now we move on to other characters. So we have Florence de Pointelac. This is a series regular. Black, in her 50s, she is Louis' widowed mother. Florence has a Creole accent and a commanding presence. She does her best to turn a blind eye to Louis' business, that's his brothel-owning business, and how he supports her. Although the family has always been close, she does blame Louis for his brother Paul's death, which causes irreparable damage to their relationship. Grace de Pointelac is a recurring character, Black and in her 20s. She is Louis' younger sister, described as calm with a commanding presence. Grace is betrothed to be married to Levi. So Louis does have a sister that gets married in the books. They are not characters that matter at all other than for Louis to feel guilty about because he has to abandon his family to go live his vampire life. But apparently they're going to be much more active characters in this TV show. Levi is a recurring character in his 20s to 30s, described as a true gentleman. He is the fiancé and later husband of Louis' sister Grace. Levi is sure to show respect to the entire family. Doesn't say what ethnicity they want him to be, so I guess he could be anything. Uncle Vervon is a recurring character in his 30s or 40s and described as a voodoo priest who seems to have otherworldly instruments and eccentricities. He's able to use spells, at one point helping Louis to win at poker, although the true capacity of his powers remains to be seen. So it doesn't say that Uncle Vervon is now Louis' uncle. In the books, he is Merrick's uncle. He is a descendant of Julian Mayfair, who is the witch, who is also like the progenitor of every other witch character in all the other books, because Julian got around. If Uncle Vervon is now Louis' uncle, then that would make Louis and Merrick distant cousins. So if they are going to do Merrick, that'd be tricky. But given the fact that Louis hasn't been required to be in more than one season, I'm guessing Merrick might not be happening in their plans of these 6 TV series that they're planning. Alderman Fenwick, new character, never heard of him, is a recurring character in his 40s and 50s and described as ill-mannered, rude, and irksome, an elected local official as well as a drunk. Fenwick runs in the same circles as Louis and is a constant fixture at Louis' club, always with different women and a cause of trouble. All right, so we have an villainous sort of character, someone to make probably Lestat look good by comparison. They're going to give this awful politician. Okay. Finn O'Shea is a recurring character in his 30s or 50s, described as Louis' lackey. The pair get along well, and Finn protects Louis. Oh, Louis has a friend now. Louis definitely doesn't have a friend in the books. Oh, I would have originally thought that maybe Finn would be Louis' like secret boyfriend, but if he's not questioning his sexuality till he meets Lestat, I guess they're just bros. Finn is an overweight bouncer at a club in New Orleans. Finn is likely a bouncer at Louis' club, given how connected the pair are, and that Finn is described as Louis' lackey. Okay. Bricktop Williams is a recurring character in her 20s and 30s, a curvy Haitian woman and Louis' best earner at his brothel, which is no surprise with how smooth she is with customers. Bricktop is serene, cool, and composed and knows how to communicate with her customers. So considering that he has a girl working at his brothel named Bricktop, gives me the impression that he does not have classy, fancy brothels. He probably has very seedy brothels. Rashid is a recurring character in his 20s and 30s, described as Louis' companion in present day. He is primarily in the background of Louis' mansion with his face in a tablet. So here's what I'm saying. Daniel, 60 to 70-year-old Daniel, finds Louis in present day, goes to his mansion to interview him, and Louis' new boyfriend, Rashid, is in the background during these scenes when Louis is being interviewed by Daniel. So Louis is not with Lestat in present day, which if we're going to say this is like Interview with the Vampire bumped up to modern times, during 1973 when Louis was interviewed the first time, Lestat was asleep underground in the earth for 50 years. So maybe he still is asleep in the earth, but the fact that Louis has a new boyfriend now that he's moved on does not bode well for the shippers. But again, nothing about this article is confirmed. Anne Rice and Christopher Rice are saying absolutely nothing on Facebook or anywhere else. So my guess here is that they are either under strict NDAs and not allowed to talk about it, or their hearts are just broken that they had to give up their dream show, Canon Accurate series, and we're getting this alternate universe series instead. We all know that Anne Rice hates the Queen of the Damned movie for how much it changed from her book. She asks that no one ever mention it in her presence. Is this another Queen of the Damned situation for her? Is this why she disappeared from the internet? All my friends, of course, are still desperately trying to believe this leak isn't true. A hoax, but my gut is telling me that it's true. So, a month goes by, and then on August 13th, so a couple weeks ago, it's announced that Sam Reed has won the role of Lestat in an 8-episode TV series titled Interview with the Vampire, with the option for future series in the same universe. So maybe if this interview series does well financially, they'll do a Vampire Lestat series, maybe, but it would probably be modernized to fit with the modernized interview. Who knows? Also, around this time, we get an announcement that AMC is developing the Mayfair Witch series. So if we're getting a second 8-episode miniseries, it's going to be the Witch series first before we get any more vampires. But I know what you're thinking. Who the heck is Sam Reed? Well, he's an Australian actor who's done mostly British productions. He was in that movie Belle. Look at him in that gorgeous historical clothing. Too bad he won't get to wear clothes like that in the Interview TV series since it's set in 1910. But the fact that he's not a big American name gives me hope. I'm thinking that he just walked into his audition and wowed them with how Lestat he could be. I'm feeling optimistic about this guy, and he looks the way Lestat's described in the books, which is, classically handsome, masculine beauty, square-jawed, blonde hair, blue eyes, tall and lively muscular, looking like a matinee idol or a manly archangel. He's 34 years old, which we knew that they were going to cast an older actor. They're changing everything else about the time period and backstories of Louis's life, so, why not just let them be older? Sure, he's a more seasoned actor who will do better with the role, and I am quite pleased with this casting choice, and starting to get my hopes up for the series. Yeah, we won't get to see him in 18th century fashion, which, sadness, but if he brings this fun, exciting character to life, maybe we'll still get some good reaction gifts out of his performance. And then, the news that broke the fandom this week. On August 25th, it was announced that Jacob Anderson was cast as Louis. He's probably most famous for playing Grey Worm in Game of Thrones, the broody, mopey captain of the Unsullied Army with the tragic past. Even as awful as that show could be, him I always loved. And apparently, most of the fandom either hadn't read the Illuminati articles or were so deep in denial because there was an uproar. Louis can't be played by a black actor. He can't be a mixed-race Creole character. How will that work if he was a plantation slave owner in the 1790s, huh? A lot of racist Karens have gotten kicked out of Vampire Chronicles fan groups over the past few days, let me tell you. But this confirms it. Those Illuminati articles have got to be real. So now we know a great deal about the plot and backstory of this alternate universe version of Louis. It's 1910. He owns several brothels in New Orleans, perhaps in Storyville, though Storyville was on the decline in the 1910s, but perhaps that factors into the plot. Louis burns down his plantation in the books and frees all his slaves. Maybe he burns down his brothels in the show and frees all his sex workers. For a while, I was cringing a whole lot about the fact that they made Black Louis a pimp and played on that particular media stereotype. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, well, if these showrunners were thinking, he can't be a slave owner, so what's the next closest thing? I guess it works. I've seen a lot of people say they're thinking Louis was changed as a way to eliminate the book's backstory that he was a young plantation owner, a slave owner, because it's problematic. And it was bad for Anne Rice to write a sympathetic character who was also a slave owner in the first place. And we can't do that in 2021. But I don't think that makes much sense. I really don't think it was a matter of the showrunners thinking, having a slave owner character is problematic and we can't do that in this era of wokeness. I don't think when you're dealing with vampires that avoiding problematic subjects is at the top of anyone's concern. They've made him a brothel owner instead. He still owns people and makes his livelihood off them in a way an employer in a different industry doesn't. Sex workers aren't slaves. They get paid sometimes. There's a lot to get into with the idea of empowering consenting sex workers, working girls gotta work, and addressing victims of sex trafficking and sex slavery. We can only speculate now how Louis handles his brothels and how sex worker positive the show is going to end up being. But when I imagine the developers of this show sitting around in conversation, talking about what they're going to do with POC Louis, what backstory they're going to give him instead of the plantation, never mind that, historically speaking, they could have kept him as a mixed-race 1790s slave owner if they really wanted to. Mixed-race people did own slaves, were complicit in slavery, and they could have explored that in a way we rarely ever get to see on TV. It could have been a great vampire metaphor. But when they came up with this idea of him being a 1910s brothel owner instead, the cynical side of me can't help but doubt they were thinking, hey, yeah, Louis getting his livelihood off using women is thematically similar to how he got his livelihood off the slaves in the original, which is thematically relevant to vampires sucking the lives out of humans. No. What I think they were thinking was like, hey, if we make him a brothel owner, we get to put a lot of sexy women on screen, maybe show some boobs, Maybe even some full frontal if we're going to go full Game of Thrones with this. We don't want this show to be too gay, right? We don't want to alienate the mainstream audience. Let's put him in brothels so we get plenty of het sex on the screen for the streets. It'll be like printing money. Cha-ching! So now, even if Louis is the nicest, sweetest brothel owner in town, treating his girls like queens, he's still got this problematic backstory that's bad in a lot of the same ways that being a slave owner is bad. That's not fixing anything, the fandom cries. If you were going to fix the slave thing, how is this better? It's not, but I don't think it was supposed to be. Because I have news for you. Louis starts off his story kind of a douche. He is a very flawed character that needs to grow up, and he does it by becoming a murderer. People have this idea of Louis as this sweet, innocent cinnamon roll of a character, but he's not that. Not at all, and he never has been. Just because he suffers over the fact that he's a vampire, he's a brooding, emo, self-hating vampire, doesn't mean he's not still a vampire. Why do we keep losing sight of the fact that this is a series about vampires? Vampires are murderers, and even when they don't kill their victims, they are still using the victims without consent. It is impossible for a vampire-human relationship to be consensual because of the power differential. Louis is not a good guy, but he's a sympathetic guy, and having a sympathetic monster is the entire premise of the series. If you don't like that, this is not the series for you, let me tell you that right now. So even though Louis is now a mixed race person, he still has a problematic human life that he gives up for his problematic vampire life. And I hope that the show will really explore that human kind of monstrousness versus the monstrousness of the vampire, because that could be extremely interesting, especially from a racially charged point of view that's undeniable in the culture of New Orleans. In the book, Louis' status as a wealthy white man coming from privilege shapes his character. All his interactions with Lestat and his entire relationship to being a vampire. Louis is a snob. He's constantly looking down on Lestat and feeling superior to him. It's a big part of why Lestat is such a dick to him and why they have such a horrible relationship for a while. Louis' snobby background of privilege colors their dynamic for all the relationship conflict they have over their whole marriage. And yes, I say marriage. Anne Rice called it that herself. Louis being born into a family that owns slaves and inheriting those slaves when his father dies allows him to benefit from the horrific racist systems that this country was founded upon and has shaped the environment of systemic racism we exist in to this day, where white people benefit at the expense of people of color. This makes Louis a certain kind of person just by the nature of his birth, no matter how nice he is about it. And he's often not even all that nice. Could Louis have had the same kind of character-shaping privilege of being wealthy in that time period without being a plantation owner and a slave owner? Possibly, but he still would have benefited from the system of slavery, simply by being a white man in America in that time period, no matter what. No one was innocent. Because his privilege comes directly from owning and using people like property, it's a significant part of his character arc. After becoming a vampire, Louis talks about how he sees Black people differently in a way that his mortal sensibilities wouldn't let him before. He talks about how the vampire detachment makes him realize the worth of his slaves as people. Like, he says, I had several extremely intelligent slaves who might have done the white overseer's job just as well a long time before if I had recognized their intelligence and not feared their African appearances and manner. Besides just having his racism goggles lifted by becoming a vampire with more detached emotions, part of his journey into dealing with his monstrous nature is realizing that owning slaves is wrong. Profiting off owning people is wrong. He sets his plantation on fire, frees all his slaves, and runs off to live a more modest life in the city. Louis starts out his story as a pretty awful character, ignorant, racist, privileged, supercilious, who learns and grows and becomes a better person over the course of a story. And it's not like he isn't thoroughly and consistently punished with misery for all of his evils. That's kind of his whole deal. There's been a lot of discourse of how it's problematic to have a sympathetic character who was a slave owner. We've seen a lot of this recently with the Hamilton discourse as well. But I think in the case of Interview with the Vampire, people are forgetting that it's about vampires, not heroes. Can we compare having a sympathetic character who was a slave owner to having a sympathetic character who kills people every night? In this book, slavery is thematically connected to vampirism. Vampires use and abuse people, feed off their livelihood. Their power over other people is their privilege, and they reduce humans to chattel. Finding the vampire sympathetic creates moral questions similar to finding a slave owner sympathetic. We have a supernatural evil juxtaposed against a very human evil. Who's more of a monster here? You both are! You both win the Evil Olympics! If Anne Rice had tried to write a Southern Gothic story set in Louisiana in the 1700s that did not include slavery, it would have been downright irresponsible. Slavery is a huge part of what shaped the culture and history of the American South. One of the very first scenes in the book is Louis's disagreement with his brother, who thinks he's received this vision from God saying that they should free all their slaves and give up their wealth and live like paupers. And Louis rejects this because he is so entrenched in the system that shapes his privilege. And this choice ends up being one of the biggest regrets of his existence. He is a flawed character. He makes mistakes. If he didn't, there would be no story to tell. I love you, Louis. How can you love a character who's a former slave owner? That makes you a bad person. How can you find a character who's done bad things sympathetic and relatable? How can you love a monster who kills people to survive and has complex moral arguments about it? That makes you a bad person. Let me just say, if loving monsters, finding themes in monster fiction and media relatable and sympathetic makes me bad, I don't want to be good. Have fun with your completely morally pure media. I'll be over here in the darkness. These people. Enjoying problematic things in fiction and media does not make you problematic. Liking fictional villains does not mean you endorse villainy in the real world. Let people like things. Anne Rice is a dark writer who writes dark, dark stories. If this fandom isn't for you, fine. Be gone. Vampire Chronicles is deep. And it addresses all these problems and spends 18 books and more than 1 million words addressing them, dissecting complex moral ambiguity and ethical quandaries from varied, nuanced philosophies is the entire point of the series. Never once do any of the books say that being a slave owner is okay or romantic. Louis's journey to becoming a vampire is tragic. He doesn't get a happy ending in this book. It's not like he figures out how to be a vampire without killing people. He doesn't find a way to reconcile being a monster. He just has to learn to accept it. I mean, kind of like how I, as a white person, have to accept that my entire existence is based on a society that was founded on slavery and still benefits off systemic racism. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism. How do I live with myself? There are things I can do in my life to combat these systems, but as an individual, my power is extremely limited. And even though I want to improve society somewhat, I still have to participate in it to live. Should we all just walk into the sea? Louis tried to fight his monstrousness, just like he had his little moment of trying to fight the institution of slavery by freeing his slaves. Does this end slavery in America? No. One less plantation makes no difference at all. Likewise, he tries to fight being a vampire by eating only animals for a while, but it doesn't work, and he's profoundly physically miserable. It's only when he accepts his nature as a monster and does the true monstrous thing of sucking the life out of people for his own gain that he finds physical peace. Though his emotional torment is never ending, his emotional torment abates somewhat when he finds love with his daughter, but he never ends up being cool with the vampire thing in this book. And the daughter thing doesn't end well either. Louis's story ends in utter despair. One of the last things he says is, "You see, someone must die every night that I walk until I've the courage to end it." And he concludes his interview by calling himself an evil killer. He would walk into the sea if only he had the courage. Nothing mattered, he says. And that's the end of it. There's nothing else. This book is a tragedy. And yet, millions of people find the story and these characters relatable for all kinds of reasons. There are tons of people out there who think that anyone who could be a vampire fan must be a bad person. pearl clutchers, like the Christian moms that wouldn't let kids read Harry Potter because it promoted witchcraft or whatever. But liking something dark and twisted does not make you a bad person. Your taste in fiction and the way your heart reacts to characters is not a reflection of your real-life morality. If you're not a vampire fan, you do you. Go be a superhero fan and love all the lawful good characters you like. Me? I'm here for the vampires. Give me all the dark stuff and monsters. We were talking about the TV show, weren't we? So, yes, this TV show is not the one Anne and Christopher Rice dreamed about and spent years getting us excited about. And maybe we'll never get that show. Maybe no studios wanted to make it because it's just not right for TV and it should stay in the books. Or maybe in another 20 years, some super fan will come along and produce it. Just look at all the different versions of Dracula we've gotten over the last century, set in all different time periods with countless twists on the story and characters. But as an AU fanfic version of one of my favorite vampire stories, the AMC Interview with the Vampire show has potential to be really interesting as a vampire show in general, except for my cynical fear that they're going to lean hard into the brothel scenes to put lots of boobs on the screen for views and treat women gratuitously. But yay for more black vampires on TV, more stories about cultures that aren't all white. I just really hope that they have some people of color on the creative team, and also some sex workers. Because right now, the writers and showrunners and people they've announced so far, they're all white. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and I'm looking forward to more news about this show. Cautiously optimistic that it'll be at least fun to watch and give us some great reaction gifs for the gifts. That's right, Louis. Brad Pitt wasn't perfect for the role either, but he did a pretty good job. Especially since he hated the part, which made him really miserable on set, so he played miserable Louis really, really well. Brad Pitt may talk a lot of shit about doing Interview with the Vampire and being Louis, but we got that movie out of it. Thank you for watching my channel. If you would like to help support me making more of these videos, consider joining my Patreon. The link is in the description and stuff. I hope to see you there. This video is sponsored by my Patreon patrons, who are the best vampire fans on the internet.